Chapter 4. The ebullitions of former days. Nothing is more extraordinary than the first breaking out of a riot. Everything bursts forth everywhere at once. Was it foreseen? Yes. Was it prepared? No. Whence comes it? From the pavements. Whence falls it? From the clouds. Here insurrection assumes the character of a plot. There of an improvisation. The first comer seizes a current of the throng and leads it whither he wills. A beginning full of terror, in which is mingled a sort of formidable gaiety. First come clamours, the shops are closed, the displays of the merchants disappear. Then come isolated shots. People flee. Blows from gunstocks beat against portscotcheries, servants can be heard laughing in the courtyards of houses and saying, "There's going to be a row." A quarter of an hour had not elapsed when this is what was taking place at 20 different spots in Paris at once. In the Rue Sainte-Croix de la Bretonnerie, 20 young men, bearded and with long hair, entered a dram shop and emerged a moment later, carrying a horizontal tricolored flag covered with crape, and having at their head 3 men armed, one with a sword, one with a gun, and the third with a pike. In the Rue de Nona-Indières, a very well-dressed bourgeois, who had a prominent belly, a sonorous voice, a bald head, a lofty brow, a black beard, and one of these stiff moustaches which will not lie flat, offered cartridges publicly to passers-by. In the Rue Saint-Pierre-Montmartre, men with bare arms carried about a black flag, on which could be read in white letters this inscription: Republic or Death. In the Rue de Jeuneurs, Rue du Cadran, Rue Montorgueil, Rue Mundar, groups appeared waving flags on which could be distinguished in gold letters, the word section with a number. One of these flags was red and blue with an almost imperceptible stripe of white between. They pillaged a factory of small arms on the boulevard Saint-Martin, and 3 armourers' shops, the first in the Rue Beaubourg, the second in the Rue Michel-le-Comte, the other in the Rue du Temple. In a few minutes, the 1,000 hands of the crowd had seized and carried off 230 guns, nearly all double-barreled, 64 swords, and 83 pistols. In order to provide more arms, one man took the gun, the other the bayonet. Opposite the Quai de la Grève, young men armed with muskets installed themselves in the houses of some women for the purpose of firing. One of them had a flintlock. They rang, entered, and set about making cartridges. One of these women relates, "I did not know what cartridges were. It was my husband who told me." One cluster broke into a curiosity shop in the Rue de Vieilles Hautes, and seized yataghans and Turkish arms. The body of a mason who had been killed by a gunshot lay in the Rue de la Perle. And then on the right bank, the left bank, on the quays, on the boulevards, in the Latin country, in the quarter of the Halles, panting men, artisans, students, members of sections read proclamations and shouted, "To arms!" Broke street lanterns. Unharnessed carriages. Unpaved the streets, broke in the doors of houses, uprooted trees, rummaged cellars, rolled out hogsheads, heaped up paving stones, rough slabs, furniture, and planks, and made barricades. They forced the bourgeois to assist them in this. They entered the dwellings of women, they forced them to hand over the swords and guns of their absent husbands, and they wrote on the door, with whiting, "The arms have been delivered." Some signed their names to receipts for the guns and swords and said, "Send for them tomorrow at the mayor's office." They disarmed isolated sentinels and National Guardsmen in the streets on their way to the town hall. They tore the epaulettes from officers. In the Rue du Cimetière Saint-Nicolas, an officer of the National Guard, on being pursued by a crowd armed with clubs and foils, took refuge with difficulty in a house, whence he was only able to emerge at nightfall and in disguise. In the Quartier Saint-Jacques, the students swarmed out of their hotels and ascended the Rue Saint-Hyacinthe to the Café du Progrès, or descended to the Café des Sept Billets, in the Rue de Mathurins. There, in front of the door, young men mounted on the stone corner posts, distributed arms. They plundered the timber yard in the Rue Transnonain in order to obtain material for barricades. On a single point the inhabitants resisted, at the corner of the Rue Saint-Avoy and the Rue Simon-le-Franc, where they destroyed the barricade with their own hands. At a single point the insurgents yielded. They abandoned a barricade begun in the Rue de Temple after having fired on a detachment of the National Guard, and fled through the Rue de la Corderie. The detachment picked up in the barricade a red flag, a package of cartridges, and 300 pistol balls. The National Guardsmen tore up the flag, and carried off its tattered remains on the points of their bayonets. All that we are here relating slowly and successively took place simultaneously at all points of the city in the midst of a vast tumult, like a mass of tongues of lightning in one clap of thunder. In less than an hour, 27 barricades sprang out of the earth in the quarter of the Halles alone. In the center was that famous house No. 50, which was the fortress of Jean and her 600 companions, and which, flanked on the one hand by a barricade at St. Mary, and on the other by a barricade of the Rue Maubuée, commanded 3 streets, the Rue de Arcis, the Rue Saint-Martin, and the Rue Aubrey-le-Boucher, which it faced. The barricades at right angles fell back, the one of the Rue Montorgueil on the Grande Truanderie, the other of the Rue Geoffroy-Langevin on the Rue Saint-Avoy. Without reckoning innumerable barricades in 20 other quarters of Paris, in the Marais, at Mont Sainte-Geneviève. One in the Rue Menilmontant, where was visible a porte-cochere torn from its hinges. Another near the little bridge of the Hôtel Dieu made with an écossaise, which had been unharnessed and overthrown, 300 paces from the prefecture of police. At the barricade of the Rue de Menetriers, a well-dressed man distributed money to the workmen. At the barricade of the Rue Grenétat, a horseman made his appearance and handed to the one who seemed to be the commander of the barricade what had the appearance of a roll of silver. "Here," said he, "this is to pay expenses, wine, etc." A light-haired young man, without a cravat, went from barricade to barricade, carrying passwords. Another, with a naked sword, a blue police cap on his head, placed sentinels. In the interior, beyond the barricades, the wine shops and porters' lodges were converted into guard-houses. Otherwise the riot was conducted after the most scientific military tactics. The narrow, uneven, sinuous streets, full of angles and turns, were admirably chosen. The neighborhood of the Halles, in particular, a network of streets more intricate than a forest. The Society of the Friends of the People had, it was said, undertaken to direct the insurrection in the Quartier Saint-Avoy. A man killed in the Rue du Ponceau who was searched had on his person a plan of Paris. That which had really undertaken the direction of the uprising was a sort of strange impetuosity which was in the air. The insurrection had abruptly built barricades with one hand, and with the other seized nearly all the posts of the garrison. In less than 3 hours, like a train of powder catching fire, the insurgents had invaded and occupied. On the right bank, the arsenal, the mayoralty of the Place Royale, the whole of the Marais, the Popincourt Arms Manufactory, La Galliette, the Château d'Eau, and all the streets near the Halles. On the left bank, the barracks of the veterans, Saint-Pelagie, the Place Maubert, the powder magazine of the Deux Moulins, and all the barriers. At 5 o'clock in the evening, they were masters of the Bastille, of the Lingerie, of the Blancs Manteaux. Their scouts had reached the Place des Victoires, and menaced the bank, the Petits Paris barracks, and the post office. A third of Paris was in the hands of the rioters. The conflict had been begun on a gigantic scale at all points. And, as a result of the disarming domiciliary visits, and armorers' shops hastily invaded, was, that the combat which had begun with the throwing of stones was continued with gunshots. About 6 o'clock in the evening, the Passage du Saumon became the field of battle. The uprising was at one end, the troops were at the other. They fired from one gate to the other. An observer, a dreamer, the author of this book, who had gone to get a near view of this volcano, found himself in the passage between the two fires. All that he had to protect him from the bullets was the swell of the two half-columns which separate the shops. He remained in this delicate situation for nearly half an hour. Meanwhile the call to arms was beaten, the National Guard armed in haste, the legions emerged from the mayoralities, the regiments from their barracks. Opposite the passage de l'Ancre a drummer received a blow from a dagger. Another, in the Rue du Cygne, was assailed by 30 young men who broke his instrument, and took away his sword. Another was killed in the Rue Grenier Saint-Lazare. In the Rue Michel Le Comte, 3 officers fell dead one after the other. Many of the municipal guards, on being wounded, in the Rue de Lombards, retreated. In front of the Cour Batave, a detachment of National Guards found a red flag bearing the following inscription: Republican Revolution, No. 127. Was this a revolution, in fact? The insurrection had made of the centre of Paris a sort of inextricable, tortuous, colossal citadel. There was the hearth. There, evidently, was the question. All the rest was nothing but skirmishes. The proof that all would be decided there lay in the fact that there was no fighting going on there as yet. In some regiments, the soldiers were uncertain, which added to the fearful uncertainty of the crisis. They recalled the popular ovation which had greeted the neutrality of the 53d of the line in July, 1830. 2 intrepid men, tried in great wars, the Marshal Lobau and General Bugeaud, were in command, Bugeaud under Lobau. Enormous patrols, composed of battalions of the line, enclosed in entire companies of the National Guard, and preceded by a commissary of police wearing his scarf of office, went to reconnoitre the streets in rebellion. The insurgents, on their side, placed videttes at the corners of all open spaces, and audaciously sent their patrols outside the barricades. Each side was watching the other. The government, with an army in its hand, hesitated. The night was almost upon them, and the St. Mary tocsin began to make itself heard. The Minister of War at that time, Marshal Soult, who had seen Austerlitz, regarded this with a gloomy air. These old sailors, accustomed to correct maneuvers and having as resource and guide only tactics, that compass of battles, are utterly disconcerted in the presence of that immense foam which is called public wrath. The National Guards of the suburbs rushed up in haste and disorder. A battalion of the 12th Light came at a run from St. Denis, the 14th of the line arrived from Courbevoie, the batteries of the military school had taken up their position on the Carrousel. Cannons were descending from Vincennes. Solitude was formed around the Tuileries. Louis Philippe was perfectly serene.